one waitress, one arrogant millionaire. With a grand piano, what started as a callous attempt to humiliate her turned into a moment that hushed the room and shattered egos. You won't believe how she turned the tables with nothing but her talent. It was a nice Friday evening, and the murmur of chatter filled the air at La Fontaine, an expensive restaurant nestled into the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina. The clinking of glasses, soft footfall of servers, and the faint sounds of jazz from a corner piano generated an ambience of polished indulgence. Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress with a modest demeanor and an undeniable spark in her eyes, moved rapidly across tables, balancing plates and smiles to most patrons. She was just another face in uniform, but inside she carried fantasies larger than the luxurious dining room surrounding her. Deborah's enthusiasm wasn't servicing tables, it was music. Ever since she was a youngster, the piano had been her refuge, a location where she could describe every delight, every sadness, and every whispered thought. But dreams don't pay the bills. Working long shifts at La Fontaine was in need a stepping stone toward the music academy she wished to attend. Few knew about her talent except for the restaurant crew. They occasionally caught her stealing moments at the antique upright piano in the back room during break. That night, as the evening rush began to settle, the door swung open, and in stepped Leonard. Grayson quickly recognizes the wealthy entrepreneur made an entrance. Like he dominated the room, accompanied by a few similarly sophisticated companions. Leonard projected an aura of dominance, recognized for his keen tongue and penchant for spectacle. His presence made even the most seasoned staff stand straighter. Deborah's co-workers exchanged knowing glances. Leonard was not an easy visitor. He was the sort who delighted on challenging people's buttons. For Deborah, though, he was merely additional table to handle and a lengthy night's work. But this wasn't going to be a normal tonight. When Leonard examined the room, his glance fell on Deborah. Something about she appeared to capture his interest. A slight pause, then a smirk. Deborah felt the weight of his gaze, but waved it aside, focusing instead on replenishing water glasses and cleaning dishes. But Leonard wasn't done with her. He'd already concluded she was going to be his entertainment for the darkness. Deborah had grown up in a tiny village in South Carolina, where aspirations of grandeur frequently felt as far away as the stars. Her mother, a single mom and a diligent caretaker, had worked double shifts as a nurse to assure Deborah and her siblings had food on the table. Despite their low means, music had always been a constant in their home. Her mother's old vinyl LPs and the out-of-tune piano given by a neighbor were the seeds of Deborah's love for melody. That piano became her escape as other kids played outside. Deborah spent hours teaching herself to play. She copied the tunes on the radio, subsequently moved onto classical composition she discovered in second-hand music books. Her talent didn't go overlooked. She performed at church, school, recital, and community occurrences, but recognition couldn't disguise the financial challenges that loomed over her dreams. By the time she was 18, the reality was evident. A professional music career would have to wait. Scholarships didn't come through, and family duties took precedence. Deborah tucked away her concert ambitions, replacing them with the pragmatism of making a living. Yet she couldn't totally give up. The piano was more than a fantasy. It was her identify. When she went to Raleigh a couple years back, Deborah searched out a job at La Fontaine, not merely because of the pay, but because of the grand piano hidden into the corner of the eatery. Even though she rarely had time to play it, just knowing it was there gave her a sensation of comfort. Music hadn't left her. It was simply waiting. That night, as Leonard and his entourage took their seats, Deborah reached their table bearing a tray with practiced grace. Leonard requested a top-shelf scotch. He cracked a joke loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Deborah flashed a nice smile as she received their orders, her voice steady despite the weird energy emanating from him. Deborah, yeah, Leonard murmured, staring at her name tag. Sounds like someone with a Plenty many latent abilities the remark captured. Her off guard, but she nodded graciously. They moved away to put their orders. She didn't see the knowing grin he shared with his partner, not the way his gaze followed her every motion, but Leonard wasn't simply observing. He was planned, and Deborah would shortly find herself in the center of a spectacle she never asked for. The night continued on like any other, with the hum of laughing and silverware filling the room. Deborah kept her pace steady, avoiding Leonard's stare as she moved between tables. She coped with tough customers before, but something about him felt odd, not just rude but calculated. His presence loomed like a shadow, making her nervous in a manner she couldn't quite shake. By the time the appetizers were served, Leonard has already started his performance, yet not the type Deborah expected. He held court at his table, proudly recounting tales of his accomplishment, then peppering with jabs about those who, lacking ambition. His entourage laughed dutifully as other diners shot furious looks in his direction. Deborah wanted to keep focused on her chores, but as she returned to his table with a bottle of wine, Leonard caught her off guard. "Tell me, Deborah," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "what do you do when you're not holding plates? Undoubtedly a young woman like you has dreams." His words halted her mid. Deborah paused, then provided a careful response. "I play piano occasionally," she said, lightly, wanting to keep it quick. Leonard's eyes brightened up, and an SL grin curved over his lips. "A pianist? How intriguing. Why don't you give us a little performance?" Deborah froze. The room seemed to quiet the weight of his words dangling in the air. "Oh, I couldn't," she replied hastily, producing a nervous laugh. "I'm simply here to work evening." But Leonard wasn't about to let it go. "Foolishness," he stated, his voice booming. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Certainly a future star like you isn't terrified of a small audience." His buddies giggled, clearly enjoying the other diners turned their heads, interested about the commotion. Deborah's chest squeezed. She could feel the heat of their stares, the quiet judgment waiting to reveal. She wanted to say no, to go away, but Leonard's challenge lingered in the air, carrying her to rise to it or crumple under its weight. "I really shouldn't," Deborah stammered, looks around for support, yet even her co-workers appeared unwilling to intercede. Leonard leaned back in his chair, enjoying his scotch with a smile. "I see," he murmured mockingly, "all speak, no talent. That's unsatisfactory." The words struck like a smack. Deborah's fists tightened at her side. She wasn't one to seek conflict, but the way he discarded her like she was a joke, and nobody sliced deeper than she. Expecting her mother's words rang in her thoughts. "Never let someone make you tiny, Deborah. You're larger than they'll ever knew." A period of quiet extended between them. Deborah gazed at the piano, then back at Leonard. His arrogant look dared her to accept the bait, and against her better judgment she did. "Fine," she replied, her voice calm yet low. "I'll play." The room bristling with anticipation as Deborah went toward the piano, each step carrying the weight of both dread and defiance. The eating room appeared to hold its breath as Deborah reached the shining grand piano. The warm radiance of the chandelier overhead shined a spotlight on her, isolating her from the muttering crowd. Her fingers trembled as she slipped upon the bench, the polished keys gleaming like a challenge waiting to be gathered behind her. Leonard leaned back in his chair, the picture of smug gratification, as though he had already won whatever game he was playing. Deborah closed her eyes for a instant, steadying her breath. Her heart thumped so loudly she could scarcely think. This wasn't the church recital or the cozy community gathering she'd once known. This was different. This was aggressive, yet there was no turning back. Suddenly she placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cold smoothness underneath her fingertips. The initial notes were gentle, hesitant, almost fragile. A few customers moved in their seats, and someone coughed in the rear of the room. Deborah disregarded them, her focus intensifying as she leaned into the music. She selected a tune she recognized by heart, a soulful version of CLA Delon by Dussy. The music burst into the chamber, gliding through the air like a thread, delicate but unyielding. As her confidence rose, the music swelled. Her hands moved with a grace that bellied the pandemonium inside her. The notes flowing out like a confession. Each chord seemed to convey a component of her tale, the sacrifices her mother made, the night she spent practicing in a tight room, the weight of dreams deferred but never abandoned. The diners went hushed there earlier, chatter supplanted by a collective stillness. Even Leonard, who had been speaking to his buddies, went silent. Deborah didn't need to glance at him to feel the shift in the room. The scornful energy had faded, replaced by something she couldn't quite identify. Possibly, or perhaps, humility. The song swelled, and Deborah let herself go for the first time in what felt like years. She wasn't a waitress or a striving dreamer. She was merely herself, an artist, her fingers across the keys, pulling forth feelings so raw and vivid they seemed to linger in the air like fog. By the time she touched the last chord, the room was absolutely silent. For a minute there was no sound, merely the lingering resonance of the piano. Deborah sat frozen, her hand motionless, sitting on the keys, unsure of what would come next. Then, as though liberated from a spell, the crowd surged into applause. The sound was tremendous, echoing off the walls and filling the room with a warmth Deborah hadn't expected. Several people stood clapping with a fervor that brought tears to her eyes. Her coworkers, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined in, their faces lighted with pride. Leonard nonetheless remained. That his smirk was gone, replaced by an expression Deborah couldn't quite decipher, part shock, part discomfort. He lifted his hands and clapped slowly, a hollow sound compared to the applause around him. But even his hesitant applause couldn't overpower what Deborah had just done. She had recovered her voice, and no amount of condescension could take that away. As the applause began to fade, the room appeared to exhale collectively. Deborah slowly stood, her knees still trembling, but her back straight. She peeked around, and for the first time that evening she really saw the folks observing her, not as spectators but as witnesses. Their expressions carried anything new: adoration, respect, and even a touch of awe. She didn't look at Leonard properly away. Instead, she offered a modest, courteous nod, thanking the diners who had clapped the loudest, her lips curling into a slight grin. It wasn't pride she felt, rather relief that she hadn't allowed fear hush her. But then, as though magnetized, her eyes turned to Leonard. He was still sat, his hands folded in front of him on the table. The confident sneer he'd worn so blatantly earlier was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his face was a veneer of fake impartiality, as though he couldn't determine whether to accept his mistake or double down on his arrogance. Well, Leonard finally voiced his voice louder than it needed to be, disturbing the delicate quiet that had settled over the chamber. That was unexpected. He chuckled gently, yet it lacking its usual audacity. I think talent really does come from the most unusual places. The remark struck like a heavy thump. His partners exchanged uneasy stares, confused whether to laugh or remain silent. Deborah cocked her head slightly, watching him. His words were supposed to be an olive branch, yet they were hollow, weighted down by his inability to really own the moment. Thank you, Deborah said, her tone steady and deliberate. There was no warmth in her voice, but no hatred either. She wasn't prepared to let him draw her back into the smallness he'd sought to impose. Her performance had spoken louder than any argument she could provide. Leonard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable beneath the weight of the room's collective. Looking, he pointed toward the waitress for another drink, a feeble attempt to recover his composure. You've got quite a talent, he added almost reluctantly. Deborah nodded, once her gaze unwavering. Everyone has a gift, she said, the weight of her words deliberate. It's how you choose to utilize it that matters. The room appeared to keep its inhale again, the slight sting of her reaction rippling across the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was enough. Leonard moved in his seat, his typical air of superiority sliding further with each passing second. The diners began to switch their attention back to their meals, though the energy in the room had relocated. completely where there had earlier existed the subtle hum of power and pretension. There was now something richer, a shared understanding, possibly even respect for the waiter who had reminded everyone of the power of authenticity. But Leonard wasn't just humiliated, he was exposed, and no amount of charm might shield him from the truth. Everyone in the room now saw. Deborah walked away from the piano, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Her co-workers welcomed her with modest grins and delicate nods of encouragement as she returned to her station. She still had a work to do, but something in her stance had altered. Her head was held a little higher, her motions more. When Leonard's table had quieted, his entourage, who had laughed so openly at her cost before, now avoided eye contact. Their conversation muted the swagger that once filled their part of the diner had disappeared, leaving just an unpleasant stillness in its place. The night continued, but Deborah felt lighter each step she walked through the dining room felt more purposeful, her confidence flowering in a way she hadn't anticipated as she replenished glasses and cleaned plates. Patron halted her to offer kind phrases. "You're a great one," older woman said softly as Deborah set down a coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." "Keep going," additional guy added. "You've got something exceptional. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Deborah praised them with silent humility, her heart bursting with thankfulness. They weren't simply compliments. These were validations of everything she'd worked for, everything she imagined of becoming. Leonard, however, was not so cordial. As Deborah approached his table to present the check, he looked up at her with a face that teetered between irritation and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he stated, his tone clipped. "No need to rub it." Ellen. Deborah halted, meeting his eyes directly. "It was never about proving anything to you," she answered, her voice gentle yet forceful. "I simply wanted to play." Leonard had no reaction. He fidgeted with his drink, his once commanding presence reduced to an awkward shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone at the table knew it as Leonard scrawled his signature on the check. One of his pals, a younger man with a gentler demeanor, gazed at Deborah and said, "You were fantastic, truly." The honesty in his words caught her off guard, and for a second she saw a spark of compassion in a group she had written off as shallow. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile before walking away. The night ended with Leonard and his group departing quietly, their customary grand departure replaced with a hurried retreat. Deborah watched them depart, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Leonard anymore. Her mind was already on the next phase. The tips from the night were extraordinarily generous, enough to cover her rent and spare a little more for piano lessons she'd been postponing. As she locked up and walked home, the cold air filling her lungs, Deborah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Sure, she wasn't simply a waitress, and she wasn't simply a daydream. She was an artist, and nothing, not sarcastic phrases, not financial difficulties, not fear, could take that away from her. Yet, as she walked, her thoughts weren't on the night's conflict. They centered on the future, where her dreams finally felt closer than ever. Deborah sat on the weathered seat in her little apartment, her fingertips gliding over the keys of her antique upright piano. The sound wasn't as crisp or flavorful as the big piano at La Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music poured from her heart, exactly as it usually had that night. Things moved inside her, not simply a moment of triumph, but a reality that her talent wasn't something she needed to hide or justify. It was hers, and it was enough. In the days that followed, the events at the eatery became somewhat of a local story. Clients who had observed her performance shared the tale, and word began to spread. A few days later, Deborah received a call from a man who had been eating that night, a music producer visiting from Nashville. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but an opportunity to record a demo, a step towards something she had only dared to dream of. Deborah consented, not because she felt it would transform her life suddenly, but since it felt like a door opening, one she wasn't frightened to walk through. For years she had let fear and doubt talk falsehoods into her mind telling her she wasn't enough, that her goals were too huge. But now she saw the truth. Resilience and authenticity were her greatest strengths. The incident with Leonard Grayson wasn't simply a humiliating spectacle turned victory. It was a reminder of the power of integrity. Leonard, for all his riches and arrogance, had nothing that could degrade her. He mirrored every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she subdued him with nothing except the purity of her craft. To everybody viewing her narrative, Deborah's message was clear: never let someone another define your worth. The world is filled with Leonard Grayson individuals who put their anxieties onto people. To feel strong yet genuine power comes from keeping rooted in who you are and letting your passions speak louder than their derision. As she closed the piano lid and laid her hands on the faded wood, Deborah grinned. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back on out of fear or uncertainty? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you. Take your step forward now. If exclusive stories inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Your tale might be next.